Hello, I'm John Ullman, and I'd like to welcome you to Total Training for Macromedia Flash Professional 8. I've been working with Flash for a long time, actually even before Macromedia got a hold of it. I've been an interactive developer and teacher for far longer though, over 15 years. I've made my interactive presentations and movies using a lot of tools, and I can tell you that Flash is one of the most powerful and complete software packages available for interactive design, development, and authoring. If you're just getting started, don't worry. We're going to cover everything from the basics of animation and simple authoring to advanced topics like scripting and publishing. I've been sure to include a lot of tips and tricks for you seasoned developers as well. Now, this first lesson is a quick peek into the program and how you will be working with it. If you'd like, you can just sit back and relax on this one and let me do all the work. Don't worry about missing anything yet. We'll be sure to go over everything in detail in the lessons to come. For our first lesson, we're going to do a quick pass through the Flash program by making a small animation and testing it out in a browser. That should give you a pretty good idea of the kind of things we'll be covering over this entire series. Now, the files should be on your desktop if you've run through the default installation, or of course they'll be wherever you indicated they should be. For the rest of the lessons, just make sure that you can find them and you'll know where to begin the lesson. This series is set up so that you can work right along with me if you'd like. Just open up the files and I'll be covering each lesson step by step. You can also just watch if you want. Since it's a DVD, of course you can stop at any time to rewind and review any material we've gone over. You can even bookmark any place that you'd like to return to at a later time. I've designed these lessons to take us in detail through all the aspects of Flash, drawing and managing graphics, setting up your animations and building interactivity, and of course publishing your movies. Now for this lesson we're going to be using the Dad's Workout, and we'll make a short animation starring our dad character. He's going to make his workout movie. Now there's going to be lots of tools that I'm going to be covering through this series in Flash, and in this demo I'll touch on quite a few of them. But don't worry, we're going to be going through every single feature in detail in the later lessons. I just wanted to give everybody a nice quick feel for how to build an animation in Flash, how to set up all the different things we'd like to see on our screen, and how to get things set up for the web. Now we've got quite a few things already dropped into our movie file, so let's just take a look at what we've got here. First of all, we always start with a stage area. This is going to be our presentation window. Now I've got a few things covering this up with graphics, and these are inserted in the layers in our timeline window up here at the top. Let me just turn off these layers and you can see that the dad character is in his own layer. I've got the room background, and now I can see the actual stage that we'll be publishing for the end of our movie. I'll even scale out a little bit so you can see that confined area where we're going to be setting up all the parts that we're going to be viewing in our movie. Now we've got that room background. That's going to set up a little area for our character to be working in, and of course the dad himself. Now we're going to be seeing lots of things in panels along the sides of the program in control areas. Like for instance, if I select my dad, we can see in the properties window down here what kind of element we have. And this one is actually referring over to our library. I've got my dad character that we're using. Our library is actually full with a whole bunch of other graphics that we'll be using throughout our movies, and it's a great storage place for all your Flash contents. Now I'd like to get started on this animation by adding a few more pieces to the room, and then we'll start working on a little animation for our dad character. One of the pieces in the library folder is this family portrait, and I think that would look great hanging on the wall here. It would give a little bit of warmth to the room and kind of stage the area for our user to see that dad is working out in his living room. Now the first thing I'm going to do is add a layer for this. It'll probably be one of the most common things you'll do as you're working through your movie files. We're going to use those to separate our elements and to keep track of everything that we've got going on in our movie. I'll just give this layer a name. I'll call it Portrait. And I'll go over to our storage library and I'll pull out the family portrait and drop it right into that layer. Our room looks better already. Now to get our animation started, we're going to start this off with a little close-up shot of our dad. He's going to introduce his workout video, and then we're going to go right on to the exercises. To set up our animation, we'll be using the timeline window to choreograph all the elements and set up when they're going to be appearing as our movie progresses. Now I'm going to set those two shots up right away. I'm going to give myself a little bit of space in the timeline window, and I'm going to add something called a keyframe that'll allow me to make changes to the timeline so we can create that close-up scene and the full screen version of our dad for his exercises. I'll just select the frames that I'm interested in and insert my keyframes right out of the timeline menu. Since I've got a couple keyframes now, I can go back to the first one by dropping my playhead back in frame 1, and I can make changes to the original scene so we can zoom in on the dad's face and give him his little close-up. Let me back off on the stage here just a little bit and select all those elements. and I'll just use a resize tool over here to scale that up. And by doing so, we'll zoom in on the dad's face. Now I'm also going to set something up so I know the cropping area for this. My graphics are extending well beyond the stage, and I can see that by hiding my stage layers graphics, and there I can see my white stage behind there. I'm just going to pull out a couple of guides from the rulers, and these will help me to see exactly where the crop of my stage is going to be for our final movie file, and then we can set that close up. I'll go ahead and bring my layers back, and there you can see within that green rectangle, that's where my dad character is going to show up. We can center his head up in there and maybe zoom it up a little bit more. We want a good close-up. This is his chance in the spotlight. Alright, we'll zoom back in and see if we can preview that. There we can see our green lines indicating the outside of the stage, and that looks like we're seeing just enough of the dad character to give him a chance to introduce himself at the start of our animation. Okay, so I'll center him up there just a tiny bit more. Right inside there, so we've also got some context for the room, and we've got our two scenes. Our close-up scene and our little bit further away scene so we can see the full figure of the dad. Now the dad's character is going to be doing some exercises, and that's what I'd like to set up first of all. I mentioned that the dad we're using in both of these locations, the close-up and the far-away shot, is the same dad that's sitting in our library over here. What I'd like to do to get things rolling is to make a few copies of this graphic so that we can have separate ones to animate our dad doing separate exercises. I can do that quickly and easily in this window. I've got all the management tools I need to be able to duplicate and create a copy. And I'm going to pick out 3 exercises that our dad's going to do. He's going to start off doing some deep knee bends. So I'll just name that one. And you can see that that copy appears right down below. I'll make 2 more copies the same way. One of them will be jumping jacks, and the other one will be some side stretches. So we'll give them the proper names and we'll be able to find them easily later. Now let's start off with those deep knee bends. To make changes to these duplicates, all I'll need to do is go and double-click on them right out of the library, and this is going to open up the file that consists of all of the graphics we're using for the dad character. Now you can see it has its own timeline, and I've got quite a few layers in here. For this particular animation, it actually might be better if I detach the timeline window and pull it down into the screen. I'm grabbing it from those little dots in the corner, and you can actually do this to any of the panels we'll see as we work through the program. In this case, it's going to give me a lot better view of both my dad character and the timeline window, and I can see all of these different layers we have in here. Now, it's pretty handy in Flash. We've got different ways to organize our elements, especially using all these different layers. In our first timeline window, we had the dad character selectable as a single element, but what we're finding out now is that the dad is actually made up of a whole bunch of little parts, almost like a puppet, a little marionette set up for us to be able to manipulate all the different pieces. As I click around, you can see my timeline window is showing a selection of each different part, and we could even use the hide and reveal to see which parts of our dad are going to be affected by all the different timeline controls. Our main control in animation is going to be that keyframe we made before in setting up our zoom close-up scene and our room scene for the dad. And that's the same thing I'm going to use here in order to create the animation of our dad going through his knee bend exercises. In this case, I'm going to select a whole column by using the Shift key, and I'm going to add more keyframes just like we did before. That first set of keyframes I've added is going to copy all the positions of our dad's body parts, and I'm going to add one more set of keyframes right here in the middle in order to make the changes and animate our exercise. Since each of these keyframes is independent of one another, I should be able to make changes to this entire column, and we'll set up our new position of our dad right in the middle of a deep knee bend. Now to start making changes, I'm just going to select the parts that I want to work with. I can do this by dragging on the screen or using the layer menu. Now for a deep knee bend, his feet are probably going to stay in the same position. So I'm going to take his upper body and just move it all down a little bit. And then I can work with each individual part to see how it would change in order for our dad to reach this new position. First of all, the legs. He's not just going to compress his legs, he's going to bend them. So let me zoom in just a little bit. And I'll select each part that we're going to work with individually. I'm going to use a transform tool in order to move these objects around and make changes to them, just like we would if it was a marionette puppet and we were bending his arms and legs in order to form a different position. His shins are going to bend out, and of course his knees are going to be bending out with it. So I'm just using that transform tool to rotate the body part around. The same thing with his upper thigh. And we're going to set it up as if he's right in the middle of scrunching down and exercising those legs. Now we've reformed where his legs are going to be. His arms are probably going to stretch out to his sides. So let's make a similar change there. I can start once again by selecting the pieces of his body that I want to make the changes to. I'm holding down the Shift key so I can grab all three parts. And in this case, I'm going to make it a little bit easier by moving the center of the rotation point up to his arm. Now you can see if I grab those three parts together and rotate, I'm rotating from that shoulder position instead of the middle of each part as I did with the legs. Now he's looking a little funny. I'm going to have to make some small changes to each individual element to straighten things out a little bit. But that's pretty easy. I can make whatever adjustments I want to each one of these different parts so that his arm looks a lot more natural in this position. We'll even stretch his hands up just a little bit, and he's reaching out to the side. Let's do his other arm in the same way. Once again, I'll Shift select to grab all three parts. I'll change the rotation point up to his shoulder. You can see that that started off in the center of my box square, so even though we've got a lot of little dots here, that was kind of unique in that it was the only white one, so you can identify it. And we can rotate his arm up, and then we'll just straighten out the individual positions so he doesn't have that broken arm look. Okay, we're just stretching his arms out just a little bit there. All right, now let me zoom out and let's see what we've got so far. If we're working with our timeline window, we have the dad in his original stand-up position, and we're switching out to his deep knee bend and back. A very simple animation that'll loop back and forth and allow him to run through that deep knee bend. Now we've only had to set up one position, the end result of his knee bend. To finish this little animation out, we're going to use a technique for animation called tweening. With tweening, what we'll do is set the start and the end positions of any individual object. I'm going to select that first set of keyframes, and I'll control click or right click on the PC to quickly create what we're calling a motion tween. Now with the motion tween, our program is going to figure out all the individual frames in between our two keyframes that we set up for the changes of our dad. This is going to give us a smooth transition from the first stand-up dad all the way over to the dad with a knee bend and outstretched arms. Now we will be spending more time on these tweens, but you can see how helpful they're going to be in saving us a lot of work. I've got another set of keyframes over here, and I'm just going to use my control click or right click to create a motion tween again, and we'll have our dad standing back up. So very simply, we've created a very nice animation of our dad going through his first exercise. I've got a couple more exercises to go, so let's go right to them. I'll switch off to the side stretches. Now just like before, I can change the copied original dad file that we had where he's just standing still, and I can double click it and work on this new animation. Since these started off as both copies, it looks like I'm looking at the same one, but I can see I'm working on the dad's side stretches file right up here. Now with the side stretches, we're going to do pretty much the same thing we did last time. I'm going to need some keyframes to make some changes to the poses, and I'll just set a couple of sets of keyframes up right here just like before. One in the middle and one at the end. And we'll jump right to our middle ones, and we'll change this pose out. For a side stretch, I'm going to have his left leg bend at the knee and crouch down. His right leg will stretch out, and we'll just have his arms stretch out to the side and give him a little bit of a lean. Now to accomplish that, I'm just going to pick out the pieces that we need to work with. Actually, I'm going to grab everything except for the bottom of his left leg and his shoe. I'll use Shift click to get rid of those two. We can use Shift for selecting as well as deselecting. Now I'll take the remaining pieces and I'll move them down so he goes into that crouch. Then we'll just set his knee up so that he's bending it out to crouch into that position. So I'm just going to lean that one piece over. Let's see, we'll take his thigh in a second. Make sure he's kind of bending at the ankle there. And I'll rotate his thigh out to match that as well. Okay, so there we've got a pretty good bend going on with his leg. Maybe a little tiny bit more there. Now his other leg, we're going to have that rotate up and stretch out to the side. So I just need to select all three of those pieces. Now when I've selected more than one piece, I can change that rotation point like we did earlier. So since I have all three pieces of his leg moved, I should be able to stretch this out. And that's kind of in line with his first foot. Let's set up the upper body now. I'm going to grab all of these pieces, both arms, his torso, and his head. And to start with, I'm going to lean them over because he's got to lean into this stretch. Okay. We'll give him a lean that looks like it works with that line of his body there. Very easy pose. And I'll just grab the hands. I got more than one object, so I'll change that rotation point. Stretch his arm out and give it a little straighten so he doesn't look like he's Rubber Man there. Okay, so we're doing kind of the same thing. Working with our little puppet parts of all the figures of the dad and just putting our poses together to match what we'd like him to be doing. Need a little bit more rotation in that one, I think. There we go, that's a nice straight arm. Let me get the other one set up. And of course, when we finish this, we're going to set up our tween so that we can have the computer calculate the intermediate positions of all of these parts and fill in the gaps. Okay, so a little arm straightening going on here. I'll pull his hand up into the cuff. And let's see what we've got. I've got him up and then down into his lean. I'm going to set up all of those in-between frames all at once by selecting both the first set and the second set with a shift. And I've got all these keyframes selected. Now I can also set my tween up down here in the property menu and I'll get the same thing. We've been making motion tweens for these. And let's see what we've got. There he is, kind of crouching in. We've got one more exercise to do, so let's go ahead and grab that and we'll get that done. Our jumping jacks. Now for this one, he's going to jump up in the air, stretch out his legs, and raise his arms up to his head. I think what would be better in this one is if we do two sets of keyframes instead of just one. Since he's got to move his arm all the way around, I'm going to set up an intermediate position where he's got his arms stretched out to the side, and then he raises it up over his head. Now that'll give us a little bit better motion here. So we'll just drop in our keyframes like before. I've got one set for him raising his arms out, and one set for where they're going to go over his head. Now I'm going to need him to return back down to this position, so I'll set our last keyframe set up while we have him unmoved, and that way we'll have him returning right back to the position he was before. So I'll insert one more set there. Now let's set up this intermediate position. I want his arms stretched out, and I want him jumped up into the air a little bit. Now I just want to get a little ground reference so I know when he's hopped off the ground and when he reaches back into it again. So I'm going to pull out another guide from our ruler and set that down at his feet. Once again, that's going to be an invisible marker, so it won't show up in our movie, but I can at least get his feet back down to the position where he's supposed to be. For our second set of keyframes, I'm going to have him jump up in the air a little bit. So I'm just going to take all the parts of the dad character and just move him up a little bit, and we're just going to quickly rotate him out. His legs should extend out to the side a little bit. So I'll grab all three, and using my transform tool, I will change his rotation point and rotate that leg out. Do the same thing for the other one. We'll rotate his leg right on out there so he's kind of jumped up into the air and spread his legs. He's going to have his arms stretched out to the side. So we're going to do a very similar rotation we did before. Straighten his arms out. And take that bend out. Bring his hand on up. Let's do the other arm. Okay, this is going to be our intermediate position. And his final position, we're just going to take all of these elements and straighten them out. I think I'd like his hand out a little bit so it kind of looks like that stretch. And now we'll take this final position, and it actually might be easier if I started from that mid position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of these keyframes that we've dropped in. I'll use my Control-click context menu, or that would be right-click on the PC, and I can clear those frames very easily. And by starting from this set of frames, if I just reinsert the keyframes, it'll copy from this set instead of this set. That's going to be a lot easier because we won't have to do all this arm straightening that we had to do in setting that first set up. Now it should be much easier because I can take the straight arm position of all of these parts and rotate them straight on up. I'll change that rotation point to his shoulder again, and we'll just raise him up over his head a little bit. Same thing from the other side. Now he's going to pull his legs in just a tiny bit and land on his feet. So we've got to not only do a little bit of a rotation here, but we've got to have him plant his feet back on the ground. So I'll just grab the left leg after the right leg. Grab that in there. There we go. Rotate it in just a touch. And I'll grab the whole character, and we'll have him drop back down to the ground. Now we have that nice guideline specifying where the ground point is for us. If I want to have him re-hit that intermediate point in the middle of him coming back from his jumping jack, what I'd need to do is copy these over here. And I'm going to use a keyboard technique for that. I'm going to hold down my Option or my Alt key on the PC, drag these over, and you can see the plus sign on my selection cursor. That indicates that I'm going to copy, and I'll make a copy of those. So now we've got a much more complex animation where he stretches his arms out, jumps up over his head, comes back down again. Once again, I'm going to use the Motion Tween feature to set all of those up so that the computer figures out intermediate spaces for each one of those frames, and we have a smooth animation of him jumping up and down. Okay, so without too much work and a few keyframe pose settings, we've got our dad running through the paces of 3 complete exercises. Now that we've got these small animations set up, let's go back to our main movie timeline. That'll be up here on Scene 1 at the top of our timeline window. And let's go back to our setting in the rooms. Now I'm going to pull my timeline window back up. Just like I can undock these windows by pulling them out, I can also drop them back into position and they'll snap back into place. Very convenient for organizing your workspace. Now back in our main timeline, I'd like to work on that first scene we were talking about. This is a shot where we've got a close-up on our dad and he's going to talk to us. He's got a little introduction. Now I'm going to pull my playhead back to the beginning of the movie. There's our close-up. And the first thing I want to do is I want to bring in the voice file that we're going to use for our dad speaking. Very much like the graphics, I'm going to make a layer for this so that we have a space to put it. I'll call that Dad's voiceover, so I'll be able to find it later. And we've got a sound file in our library amongst the other graphic elements called Dad Exercise. Let's preview that. I can hit the play button right up in the library window and we can get a feel for what Dad has to say.
Well, I'm told we're going to be doing some exercises. I'd better warm up.
Okay, so he's got a little warm-up speech for us. I'm going to drop that right into the voiceover layer by selecting the keyframe at the beginning of that, going down to my property menus, and setting up the sound for that keyframe as the Dad exercise that we just previewed. Now we're going to talk a lot more about sounds in the later exercises, but for right now, I'm going to make sure that that's set up to a stream synchronized sound and that it only plays through once. Now I'll need to make sure I have enough frames in my movie in order for that sound to play out. You can see a little waveform dropped up in here, so I can see that the sound's not quite finished yet. And that's okay because I can always move elements around in my timeline. I'm going to take these last frames of the movie, and the first thing I'm going to do is stretch them out a little bit. Now I'm picking 120, and I can see that that should be sufficient for my dad to finish his little speech and finish talking out at that point. So we've changed the point where we're going from the zoom close-up into that faraway look, and our exercises will be set up out here. Now to make my dad look like he's talking, we better add some animation to his mouth. Now if I take a look into my library folder, we've actually got a set of mouth shapes all ready to go. These are isolated pieces of just the dad's mouth that we can drop in and use them, and you can see they've covered different shapes for the different kinds of sounds that he might make while he's speaking. Now I've also got set up another little animation file. This is very much like the dad files we set up before. Inside of it, if I double click, we can see that I've already gone ahead and added all of those mouth shapes to the timeline. Now we're going to make an animation out of this. You can see as I roll the playhead, it'll make it look like he's moving his mouth. So let's set that up. Now we haven't used the dad animations yet. We're coming to that in a moment. But in order to use one of the animations out of the library, I pull it out exactly like I pulled out the original portrait that we were working with before. The only difference is our dad already has a mouth on him, so we're going to have to fix that. We back up a little bit in our timeline. We'll go to our dad layer and we'll select that first dad character. There he is zoomed up. And if I click on him, I can see properties down in my window down here that tell me what animation we're using and which piece we're looking at. What I'm going to do is make a special dad character that has no mouth. We also happen to have two heads in here that we can work from. One where the dad has the mouth, and one called no mouth where the dad has no mouth. I'm just going to make a copy of the original dad character like we did for the animations. So I'll duplicate it. We'll make this one dad talking. And for the dad talking one, I'm going to take the mouth out. I'll do that by clicking on the head that we have in here. That's the head straight with mouth. And I'm going to use the swap feature in my property window to change this out to the head with no mouth. Okay, so very simply, we've just made a variation on the dad with no mouth. Now I'm going to take this dad character and swap it for the talking dad that we just made. I'll swap it right out to dad talking. And now we've got a dad with no mouth. Now to add his mouth in, just like any other element I'm adding to the screen, I generally give it its own layer. So we'll make a layer for dad's mouth. I'm going to use the animated mouth that we had already set up in our library. And I'll just bring it into position in that layer. He's a little big, so we'll just use our scaling tool to set it up to the right size. We don't want our dad being such a big mouth. Okay, much more proportion to his head. Now that we've actually used one of the animations that we've made out of our library, let's test our movie and see what we've got. I can very easily do a test movie up at the control panel. And what this will do is it will simulate publishing my movie file, and we'll be looking at a version of the movie that is very much like what our user's going to see.
I'm told we're going to be doing some exercises. I'd better warm up. Well, I'm told we're going to be doing some exercises.
Now we can see we've got the animated mouth working fairly well, but he's talking way too much. There's lots of places in the sound file where he goes silent and his mouth should probably be closed at that point. So let's use that swap feature we just saw, and we can alternate between the mouth closed and the mouth open and animated. Once again, I'm going to do this with keyframes. Now luckily I can see a lot in the timeline about where he's talking and where he's silent. And if I scrub along the timeline, you can also hear the sound coming in pieces, so we can really make sure we match the right locations with the right picture. I'm going to use keyframes for this, so I'll insert my keyframes at a position where his mouth is supposed to go from closed to open, and I'll simply go to the previous keyframe position where we've got the animated mouth, and we'll swap that over to the mouth closed. So we're tracking mouth closed, mouth animated. He stops talking again here, right after well, so we'll swap it again. I'll just insert another keyframe. And set one up where he's starting to talk. Now this one should be the mouth closed, so we'll just make sure we go back and swap that one. Okay, so now our graphic is silent when the sound is silent. I think we've got another one over here. I'll scrub down to see.
I thought we're going to be doing some exercise.
Right about there. Let's do the same thing again. We'll insert a keyframe to switch it to the mouth closed and open it. And I think we've got one more close over here at the end. So I'll just insert all the keyframes first so we can get that out of the way.
I'd better warm up.
Right about there, we've got him closed again. Now I just need to make sure that we swapped out the correct ones. Here we've got the animated mouth. We're going to go for the closed one. There it should be animated, and here it should be closed again. Okay, I'm going to test our movie, and we'll see how that's worked for us.
Well, I'm told we're going to be doing some exercises. I'd better warm up.
Much better,
Well,
because he actually looks like he's speaking, and we've got him closing his mouth at the right points. It really helps the illusion work. Now I can fine-tune this a tiny bit more, especially with that first word, well. As we played it, you might have noticed a little disconnect between what his mouth shape was and the word he was making, because he had that long drawn-out L at the end. So, what I can do is take advantage of one other feature where I can pick out the mouth shapes that I'd like to use. Let me go to the first one. He's saying the word well here, so if you say that to yourself and watch your own mouth shape, you can see that your mouth shouldn't probably be open as much when you're starting to make that kind of a sound. What I'm going to do to fix this is I'm going to take advantage of a special feature of the kinds of symbols we can use out of our library. We've been using movie clip symbols, but what I'm going to do is switch this to what's called a graphic symbol. A graphic symbol will allow me to control the playback of the animated symbols we have here. I have a choice of setting them up to loop, play a single time through, or only show a single frame, and that's what I'm going to make use of here. By choosing single frame, I can pick out which frame I want to show. And if I go to frame 14, you can find that out by looking inside the mouse animated file. That's a much better shape for the word well. His mouth's much more closed, and it's a good way to start that word out. Now I'm going to do the same thing. Since this is drawn out, I'm going to put a mouth shape in for the E sound and for the L sound that runs after this. And I'll just make additional changes using my keyframes to make the settings, and going down to my mouth properties and setting the frame to a value that will work good for it. Now with the E sound, his mouth should be much more open. So I'm going to go back to frame 1, and you can see there he's starting to say well, and we need an L sound. I'll add another keyframe for that. And this time I'm looking for something around frame 8. There you go. His tongue's on the top of his mouth, and he's kind of saying that well word. Let's see how that affects our animation. I'll test our movie once more.
well, I'm told we're going to be doing some exercises. I'd better...
Makes a surprising difference. With that change, we've made it look like our dad character is saying exactly what the sound file says. Now let's bring in those other animations for the exercises we set up before. I'm going to zoom back out on my timeline. I've got a nice control up here that allow me to set and select the zoom rate for this stage so that I can move back at controlled rates and see exactly what's going on at different points in the movie. We're going to be dealing with our wide angle shot here, and what I want to do is add in the animations of our dad going through the different exercises that we set up in our previous animations. Get a little bit more space for this. Now the current frame here shows our dad character, and what I want to do is add in the dad animations that we set up for the jumping jacks, the knee bends, and the side stretches. Now at this point we won't want the dad's mouth in here because we're using a dad character that already has a mouth in it. I can remove the mouth by inserting something similar to a keyframe, but in this case it'll be a blank keyframe. This will remove the graphic of the mouth and make sure that we don't have it carrying along in the rest of our presentation. Now I'll need some keyframes in order to change the animation out to the different exercising dads that we have. So first of all, I want to have my elements stay on the screen a little bit longer. And I'm going to accomplish that by going out and selecting in my timeline somewhere around frame 180. And this time I'm going to insert something different. I'm going to insert a frame instead of a keyframe. You'll see our graphic looks a little bit different. I don't have that dot at the end. And simply what I'm doing here is making sure that all of these pieces are staying out on the timeline for the entire duration. Now I can see I copied my sound into this frame, and I really don't want the dad talking again. So I'm going to clean that up by selecting the keyframe and doing the opposite of what we did to set the sound file up originally. We selected the dad exercise sound to play it. I'm going to select none to make sure it doesn't get played. Now we'll insert the other exercise animations. I'll do so with a keyframe once again. Now I'm just leaving some arbitrary space in between here, and we'll see how we're going to use that in a moment. But I'm going to insert a keyframe, and similar to our method of manipulating the mouth file, I'm going to go down to the dad animation and swap this instance of the dad for one of our animated dad exercises. Let me pick knee bends off first. I'm going to do the same thing to add the other two exercises in. We'll add a keyframe. This time change it from knee bends to, let's say, jumping jacks. And one more for our last exercise. We've got our side stretches there. Now the way this is set up in the timeline, our dad will just run through each animation, bouncing from one to the next. It'll look a little bit random because we don't want the dad just playing each animation one after the other. We want to have some kind of an introduction for it. This is going to give us a chance to put a little interactivity into our presentation. What we'll do is we'll let the user who's viewing this file control which exercises the dad's going to perform. Now we've got the exercises set up. I'm going to set a little structure framework around this so that we can put in, number one, some buttons to control the animation, and number two, some scripting to make it all work properly. Let's do the buttons first. My buttons are going to be a graphic element, so I'm going to insert a layer for them, just like all the other graphics that we've done so far. I'm also going to set a position for them to start by using that blank keyframe that we used before. A blank keyframe is exactly what it implies. We've got a keyframe to make changes, but it doesn't have any artwork in it. But that's okay, I can fill up the artwork with any of my tool palettes over on the side. I'm going to draw a simple rectangle for my buttons. Now I'm going to pick the color for this rectangle before we do it. I'll use the paint bucket to set the interior fill of my rectangle, and I'm going to choose a medium blue color. For my stroke color, I'm going to choose a little bit darker blue, and I can also use the properties down here to set up things like the width and the pattern of the line. I'm simply going to change the width to a little bit thicker line, let's say 5 pixels. Now when I have my rectangle tool selected, I can use the options to modify what kind of rectangle I'm going to draw, and I'm going to use this tool here to allow me to put a little corner radius in so I'll have rounded corners on my rectangle. Something like 4 pixels should be fine. Now I'm ready to go ahead and draw the shape of my button. Our rectangle is a simple but effective shape for a button. We'll find out when we work on buttons later in our lessons that you can make a button out of just about any graphic that you have in the program. Now I'm going to make this into a button by selecting it, and using another feature in our Modify menu, I'm going to use a Convert to Symbol. This will take our graphic, which is just a normal rectangle, and make it into a symbol, which is one of our library elements over here on the side. We've had a quick chance to look at both movie clips and graphics, and you'll see that the third type of symbol, that's our button. I'm just going to give this symbol a name, and it gets added to our library file just like that. Now I'm actually going to want a few more buttons instead of just this one. So, like we did before, I'm going to drag another copy of our button symbol out, and I'll actually want one of them for each one of the exercises, and another button which we'll use to make the dad stop exercising. I can do a quick arrangement of these symbols by selecting them, and this will give us a chance to use our Align palette up in here. These tools will allow us to line up all of our objects vertically or horizontally and even set the spacing for them. For our exercise, I'm going to use an alignment to the top edge that lines them all up nicely horizontally this way, and I'm going to use a horizontal spacing tool to make sure that they have even space between them. Now our buttons aren't going to be very good without any labels on them, so let's zoom in a little bit and set those up. I'm going to grab all 3 of these and move them down just a little bit because we've got a little bit more room on our screen. And I'm going to add another layer where we'll put some text labels for our buttons. We're using a technique here where we're actually using the same button graphic but putting different labels on them to simulate different buttons. We'll be showing this and some other techniques later on in the lessons as well. I'll make my text with our text tool, and that's a fairly straightforward tool. My text properties all appear down in the property panel, and I can set up very easily things like font, size, and color. I'm going to choose white and a 10-point size with the Verdana font, and then make sure my text gets centered up. I'll just type in a label for each one of the buttons. This one will be our knee bends. Then we've got jumping jacks and our side stretch. The label for the bottom button will be take a break, and we'll use this one to have our dad stop exercising. Now I can use the same alignment tools to make sure that my text is all lined up properly. I'll line them all up at the top, and I can even use my spacing. I can also go in and just move these elements around very precisely by using the arrow keys to nudge them left, right, or up and down. Now I'll also put a label for the buttons themselves. I'll do this with the text tool, and we'll change our text properties just a little bit. So I have a little bit slightly larger text. I'll go with a dark blue color, and I'll just put a label up here for what these buttons are going to be. We'll just say, what kind of exercise should Dad do? I'll center that up over our buttons, and with that we've set up a little area where our user knows exactly what's going on. Now we've got buttons to trigger our interactivity. we're going to have to set up a few elements up in here to get the actions to work properly at the right time. First of all, I've noticed that my text labels are actually showing up in the beginning zoom part of our graphic. That's because we have the keyframe located down here at the first frame. Well, we can remedy that very quickly by grabbing that keyframe that we made and dragging it on down the timeline until it's in the right place where we're doing our widescreen shot with the buttons. I'll place it right there. Now also in our timeline, I'm going to need a few pieces of script to exercise control. Our natural timelines play straight through. Now we've got keyframes in these locations signifying where my dad is going to change from one exercise to the other. I'm going to use some scripting to stop the playhead from playing right through the timeline like it normally does. Once again, I'm going to add a layer for this. You can see we use layers a lot in this program for keeping all of our elements easy to find and easy to modify. I'll just call this layer Actions because we're going to be using the Action scripting program to control the timeline. In order to execute our controls, once again, I'm going to need some keyframes to set things up for us. So I'm going to add a keyframe somewhere here before our dad starts his first exercise. But this time, on the keyframe, we're going to be adding not a graphic object or a sound object, but an action object. I've got my Actions panel docked right here to the top of the screen. And if I click on the title, it'll open that panel up. It's going to set my action for that keyframe that we had selected, and I'm going to use a very simple one, stop. I can have the program even type it for me by double-clicking on the action that I want to perform. Now let me get this Actions panel out of the way again. I'll do that by clicking on the title once more, and it'll collapse up and stay up there in case we need it later. What this will do is make sure that as my dad finishes his intro and he's standing there waiting for us to do something, the playhead won't go on by itself and start playing the 3 exercises that we have set up. Now I'm also going to need stops in between each one of these exercises. In the same way that the playhead would run right through and start the exercises, it'll bounce from one to the other unless we tell it to do otherwise. Let's do that by copying this keyframe with the stop action into each one of our animation segments. I can copy a whole keyframe of information by using a special copy down in the timeline section of my edit panel, which is set up to copy frames. Our normal copy command won't copy all of the elements of the frame, just the graphics, but our copy frames command will grab everything in it, including our little action script. With that copied, I can drop in a blank keyframe in each one of our exercise sections, and I can paste our action right in there. You can see that little A appears, showing us that our action has been copied correctly. I'll do one more for the next exercise. And one for the last. Now one other feature that I'm going to use to help us navigate around our movie is called a label. We're going to set a label on a frame, very much like all the other settings we've done so far. It's going to be on a keyframe. So I'm going to insert a keyframe, and we can label that keyframe by going right down to the Properties menu. You can see here where it says Frame Label. I'll label this one Waiting, because that's what our dad is doing at this point. He should be waiting to do an exercise. I enter the label in, and you can see the label appears right up here at the top with a little flag indicating the frame that it's on. I'm going to add a label for each one of the exercises that calls out the exercise my dad's going to be doing. We'll insert a keyframe. This keyframe is a knee bend exercise. The next one is our jumping jack exercise. And the last one is our side stretch exercise. Now let's see how all this structure is going to work together with a couple more actions in order to control the flow of our animation. At this point, I'm ready to go back to my buttons and add some actions to them. Now instead of using the Actions window as we did before, I'm going to use another panel that we can use to add actions to our program, and that's the Behaviors panel. I'm going to select a very simple behavior, go to and play it frame or label, and all I'll do is type in the name of the label I want it to go to. I've selected the knee bend button, so I want to go to the knee bend label. Let's do the same for our other buttons. Our jumping jack button is going to go to the jumping jack label. And our side stretch to the side stretch label. Our Take a Break button is simply going to go back to that waiting label we made at the beginning of this section. Now we've set up a lot of different scripts here, so let's review what they're all going to do together. Normally my timeline plays right through all of the frames, but when it enters the waiting section, we've got it set up to stop right here at frame 130. The buttons will be visible on the screen, and the buttons are set to move the playhead to any one of those 3 additional labels based on which button my user selects. As soon as it goes to one of those labeled positions, it'll play the animation, but it'll also stop before going on to the next one. You can see that behavior is carried forward for each one of these. And by clicking on another button, my user can run from one animation to the other, or choose the Take a Break button and bring it back to this point where the dad's not doing any exercises, and it stops once again. Let's try this out. I'm going to test our movie at this point.
Well, I'm told we're going to be doing some exercises. I'd better warm up.
You can see our movie has moved into the wide shot and stopped exactly as we said it would, right in the waiting section. My user can click on any one of these buttons and have our dad do the exercise. Let's try the stride stretch. How about those knee bends? Okay, Dad, you can take a break. Now we've got a well-assembled animation, and it includes all of our interactive structure that we've built into it as well. We're ready to publish. I'm going to do a quick one because our publishing is all controlled by this section of our file menu, where we've got settings that will control what kind of files we'll make, and the publish button will actually go and make those files. I'm going to use the default settings in the program just to show that they're more than good enough in order to get our files out. I'm also going to use our third option, which is Publish Preview. This will publish according to the default settings, and it'll bring our file right up into a browser so we can see what it's going to look like for our users. I'll just publish to default. It'll make our files.
I'm told we're going to be doing some exercises. I'd better warm up.
You can see our animation plays in the browser window exactly as it did in our test window, and this is exactly what our users would see if we published this on our website and gave them the address to go there. Even our interactivity is going to work exactly the way we had it planned. And that's how easy it is to create movies inside of Flash. Now we've got a lot more exercises to go through, and as you can see, a lot of details to cover. So let's get to it.